The horses' hooves hit the dry earth like thunder, and Minnie Langston heard them coming from 300 yards away. She knew that sound. She had spent 6 months trying to forget it, trying to scrub it from her memory the way she scrubbed bloodstains from linen, with hard water and harder effort, and the stubborn conviction that some things could simply be erased if you pressed hard enough. But the sound of Luke Bishop riding with purpose was not a thing a woman forgot. It was a sound that lived in the chest, right beneath the sternum, and it vibrated there like a plucked string long after the source had gone. She pressed herself against the inside of her door and told herself she would not answer it. She told herself that twice more before the knocking came, 3 heavy blows that shook the frame, and then his voice, low and certain as a drawn weapon. "Minnie, I know you are in there." She pressed her palm flat against the rough wood and said nothing. "I am not leaving without you." 5 words. 5 words that split her open from the collarbone down, because they were the 5 words she had spent every single day for 6 months praying she would hear and dreading in equal measure, because they meant everything had changed, and they also meant she had no more room to hide. The secret she had carried like a stone inside her ribs, the betrayal she had never fully spoken aloud, the dark past that lived beneath the floorboards of her rented room like something buried and still breathing. All of it would have to come out now. Because Luke Bishop had ridden to her door in the blazing Colorado sun of August 1882, and he was not leaving without her, and Minnie Langston had never once in her life been able to say no to a man who meant exactly what he said. She reached for the latch. Her fingers were shaking. She had not always been afraid. There had been a time, not so very long ago in the measure of years, but an entire lifetime ago in the measure of suffering, when Minnie Langston had been the most fearless woman in Redstone Creek, Colorado. She had arrived in the spring of 1881 on the stagecoach from Denver, 24 years old, red-haired, and carrying nothing but a carpetbag, and the kind of quiet determination that people sometimes mistake for arrogance, until they realize it is something far more dangerous, which is a person who has genuinely decided they have nothing left to lose. She had come to Redstone Creek because her brother, Thomas Langston, had sent her a letter 8 months before his death that said the town was growing, that a woman with her skill for herbs and healing could make a real living, that the frontier still had room for people willing to work without apology. Thomas had not mentioned that Redstone Creek was also home to 2 competing cattle operations, whose rivalry had recently begun expressing itself in gunfire, or that the town's marshal had been shot dead in March, and not yet replaced, or that the man who had effectively been keeping the peace through sheer force of reputation alone was a 31-year-old sheriff named Luke Bishop who had come down from Wyoming 4 years earlier for reasons that nobody in Redstone Creek seemed to know with any certainty. Minnie had learned all of this within approximately 48 hours of arriving, because the woman who rented her a room at the boarding house on Crane Street, a stout widow named Clara Holt, believed that newcomers deserved to be armed with information the way soldiers deserved to be armed with rifles, thoroughly and without delay. Luke Bishop, Clara had said, setting a plate of salt pork and beans in front of Minnie on her first evening, is the most aggravating man in the whole of Fremont County, and that includes the Decker brothers who once shot at each other over a dog. He is fair. He is honest. He does not drink to excess, and he does not chase skirts, and he does not take money he has not earned. Those are his good qualities. His bad quality is that he is proud as Lucifer himself and twice as stubborn, and he has decided that the only way to keep peace in this town is to be entirely alone in the keeping of it, which means he trusts nobody and confides in nobody and accepts help from nobody. And a man who will not accept help will eventually fall, Miss Langston. You mark my words. Minnie had marked them. She had also, within the first week, met Luke Bishop himself, and discovered that Clara Holt's description was accurate in every particular except perhaps the comparison to Lucifer, because Lucifer, by all accounts, had been beautiful in a showy, obvious sort of way, and Luke Bishop's attractiveness was nothing like that. It was the kind that ambushed you. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that needed cutting and gray eyes that were the color of creek water in November, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved by someone who considered softness a waste of effort. He had a sheriff's star pinned to a worn canvas coat, and he moved through the town with the unhurried authority of a man who knew that everyone was watching and had long since ceased to care. Their first meeting had been professional. Minnie had been setting up her herbalist's corner in the back of Tanner's general store, organizing her dried valerian and her willow bark and her packets of slippery elm, when Luke Bishop had walked in to ask Amos Tanner about a shipment of ammunition. He had glanced over at her arrangement with no particular expression and said, "You the healer Clara Holt was talking about." "I am a medical herbalist," Minnie had said, because she had learned that precision in self-description prevented a great deal of misunderstanding. "Minnie Langston, my brother Thomas spoke highly of this town." Something had shifted in his expression at Thomas's name, something so brief she nearly missed it, a shadow crossing open ground. "Thomas Langston was a good man," he had said. "I am sorry for your loss, Miss Langston. He spoke highly of you too." She had not expected that. She had expected indifference, the casual dismissal that frontier men often offered to women with professional ambitions. She had not expected him to know her brother's name, to speak it with genuine respect, to look at her as though her loss was a real thing that mattered. "You knew him?" she had asked. "He treated my deputy's broken hand last winter," Luke had said. "Would not take a cent for it. Said the man had enough trouble without adding medical debt." He had paused. "I tried to pay him myself. He would not take it from me either. Said a town was only as good as the way it took care of its own." Minnie had felt the grief rise up fast and hard, the way it sometimes did without warning, like a wave that appeared from nowhere on a still day. She had pressed it down with the same practiced steadiness she used for everything. "That sounds like Thomas," she had said. Luke had nodded once, and there had been a moment of something between them, quiet and warm and unexpected, before he had put his hat back on and finished his business with Amos Tanner and walked back out into the sun. Minnie had watched him go and told herself firmly that she had come to Redstone Creek to build a life, not to complicate one. She had failed at that resolution in approximately 3 weeks. It had started slowly, the way the most significant things always did. Luke Bishop had a habit of stopping by Tanner's store in the late afternoon, ostensibly to check in on the town's general state of affairs, which apparently required a brief exchange with whoever happened to be present at the back corner, where Minnie kept her herbs. She had begun to notice that his afternoon rounds coincided with her own schedule, with a frequency that seemed unlikely to be accidental. She had said nothing about this, because pointing out a pattern gives it power, and she was not yet certain she wanted this particular pattern to have power. What she was certain of was that Luke Bishop, underneath the pride and the isolation and the self-sufficient armor he wore as naturally as other men wore their hats, was deeply lonely. She could see it in the way he listened when she spoke, with his full attention, as though he had forgotten what it felt like to have someone's words directed specifically at him, rather than at the office he represented. She could see it in the small things he did, the way he had fixed the broken step at the boarding house without being asked, the way he always tipped his hat to Clara Holt with a formality that was really a form of respect for a woman who had no husband to offer her any. She could see it in his eyes when he thought nobody was looking, which was an expression she recognized because she had seen it often enough in her own mirror. By the end of April, they had fallen into something that both of them refused to name for several weeks, because naming it made it real, and real things could be destroyed, and both of them had lost enough real things to be cautious. They talked every afternoon. They argued about medicine, because Luke had old-fashioned ideas about doctors being superior to herbalists, and Minnie had extensive opinions about the limitations of physicians who had never studied plant compounds. They agreed about almost nothing except that Redstone Creek was worth protecting, and that Thomas Langston had been a finer man than most. Luke began walking her home in the evenings. The first time he reached for her hand while they walked, neither of them said anything about it. They simply kept walking. The first time he kissed her was on the 5th of May, 1881, in the alley beside Tanner's store during a thunderstorm that had come up so fast nobody had time to get indoors properly. She had ducked into the alley to keep her herb packets dry, and he had followed her because he had been 2 steps behind her when the rain broke, and they had stood pressed together against the wall with the storm crashing around them and the world gone silver and wet. And he had looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something open and unguarded and almost frightened, and then he had kissed her with a care that undid her completely. She had pulled back after a moment and looked at him in the half-dark and said, "Luke Bishop, if you kiss me like that and then go back to being proud and solitary and impossible, I will make your life very uncomfortable." He had almost smiled. Almost. "I have been told I am already impossible," he had said. "Then you have nothing to lose by stopping," she had said, and he had kissed her again. What followed those first weeks was the most extraordinary stretch of Minnie Langston's life. She had been loved before, or so she had thought, by a man in Denver named Gerald Kane, who had proven to be neither as loving nor as honest as he had presented himself. But what she had with Luke Bishop was different in a way that was almost physically distinct. He was not easy. He was not demonstrative in public. He was not a man who said beautiful things. But he was present in a way that Gerald Kane had never managed, attentive in a way that felt like being genuinely seen rather than merely observed, and there was a steadiness to him that she found herself depending on in ways that frightened her, because she did not believe in depending on things that could be taken away. And there were things she was not telling him. That was the truth she carried, the hidden weight, the secret that sat at the center of everything like a stone at the center of a stream, dividing the current of her life into the part that flowed toward Luke and the part that flowed away from him. The secret had a name. It had a name and a face and a set of demands, and the demands had been arriving in letters since January, 6 months before she had come to Redstone Creek, and they had not stopped. Gerald Kane was not a man who let things go. She had not told Luke about Gerald because there had never been a right moment, and because she was ashamed, and because she had made a mistake that could not be fully explained without also explaining a dozen other mistakes that led up to it, and because she had told herself it was handled, that Gerald would stop, that the threats would fade if she simply refused to engage with them. She had been wrong about all of that. The summer of 1881 in Redstone Creek was the most beautiful summer of Minnie's life. She established her herbalist practice. She earned the trust of the town's women, who came to her for the things they could not say to their husbands, or to the young physician who had arrived in June and knew a great deal about surgery, and almost nothing about the long, quiet work of keeping people well. She made friends, real ones, women like Clara Holt and a rancher's wife named Della Pierce who had a laugh like a firecracker and an opinion about everything. She fell in love with Luke Bishop the way rivers fall toward the sea, steadily and inevitably, and without the possibility of reversal. And the letters kept coming. Gerald Kane had been, before she met him, a man with a face like promise and a soul like a trap. She had understood the trap eventually, but by then she had already made the mistake that he used against her, a financial arrangement she had entered in good faith that turned out to be tied to money Gerald had acquired in ways that were not entirely legal, and her signature on certain documents made her look complicit in things she had not known were happening. Gerald was not stupid. He was the specific kind of clever that organized itself around the exploitation of other people's trust, and he had organized himself around Minnie's trust with particular thoroughness. The letters said, "Come back to Denver. Sign the documents I need you to sign, or I will make sure the sheriff of Redstone Creek knows exactly what kind of woman he has been keeping company with." The threat had a particular cruelty because it was not entirely wrong. The documents existed. Her signature was on them. A certain reading of the facts, particularly the reading that Gerald would arrange, could make her look like a participant in fraud. She was not guilty. She had not known. But not guilty and easily defended were two different things, and she knew that Luke Bishop, who lived by a code of law and honesty as rigid and bright as the star he wore on his chest, would not be able to simply set aside the appearance of criminality in the woman he was falling in love with. His pride would not allow it. More than that, the reality of his position would not allow it. A sheriff could not be seen to countenance fraud, so she had said nothing. She had kept the letters hidden in the bottom of her carpetbag. She had written back to Gerald twice, both times refusing his demands, and she had told herself each time that he would give up, that the threat was empty, that a man of Gerald Kane's essentially cowardly nature would not actually travel 400 miles to destroy her life when he could find a simpler target elsewhere. She had been catastrophically wrong. Gerald Kane arrived in Redstone Creek on the 3rd of October, 1881, on the afternoon stage from Denver, and he walked straight to Luke Bishop's office, and he laid the documents on Luke's desk, and he told his version of events with the polished plausibility of a man who had rehearsed it many times. Minnie did not know this had happened until Luke came to find her that evening. She had been in her workroom at the back of Tanner's, grinding dried echinacea root with a stone mortar, and she had known the moment she saw his face that everything had broken. Not cracked, broken. "Gerald Kane came to see me today," Luke said. His voice was the controlled, careful voice of a man who was holding something enormous very still. "He says you were his business partner in Denver. He says you signed documents authorizing the transfer of funds that belong to other people. He says the whole herbalist operation here is you running from a fraud warrant that he has not yet filed but intends to file if certain conditions are not met." Minnie set down her mortar. Her hands were steadier than she had any right to expect. "Gerald Kane is a liar," she said. "I know what he is," Luke said quietly, and that was the part that made her heart drop because his next words proved that knowing what Gerald was had not been enough. "But those documents, Minnie, your name is on them. His attorney has already confirmed they are genuine. I cannot—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "I cannot ignore evidence that has been formally presented to me in my capacity as law enforcement." "You know I cannot." "I know," she said. "Tell me it is not what he says it is," Luke said, and there was something in his voice underneath the controlled professionalism, something raw and frightened, and she knew that he was asking her not as a sheriff but as a man who had given her the unguarded part of himself that he had never given anyone before, the part that had no armor, the part that needed her to say one clear true thing that he could hold on to. She could have told him all of it then. She could have explained, laid out the whole history, the innocence and the ignorance and the specific chain of events that had led to her signature on those papers. She had rehearsed that explanation in her head 100 times, but she looked at his face and saw the thing she had been afraid of, the conflict between what he felt and what he was, the sheriff and the man at war with each other, and she was seized by a terror that was not rational but was entirely real. That if she tried to explain and he looked at her afterward with doubt, just a shadow of doubt, she would not survive it. She had built something real in Redstone Creek. She had built it out of her own hands and her brother's memory and her love for a man who deserved someone without a complicated past. If she tried to tell the truth and it was not believed, she would have nothing left. So she did the worst possible thing. She said, "I think it is better if I leave Redstone Creek for a while until this is sorted out." The silence that followed was like the moment after a rifle shot, everything suspended. "Leave," Luke repeated. "Yes. You are going to leave," he said, "instead of telling me the truth." "I am telling you no," he said, and the word was quiet and absolute. "You are not. I know what telling the truth looks like, Minnie. I have been doing it my whole life, even when it costs me, and I know what it looks like when a person decides that running is easier." His jaw was tight. His eyes were the cold gray of creek water in November again, not the warm gray she had learned. "If that is your decision, then I cannot stop you. but I want you to know that I will not wait for someone who chooses to disappear instead of trust me." He left. He walked out of her workroom and back into the Redstone Creek evening, and Minnie stood with her stone mortar in her hand and felt the architecture of everything she had built collapse around her. She left on the morning stage 2 days later. She settled in a town called Harrow, 40 miles north, which was small enough that nobody would ask questions and large enough that she could find work. She sent Gerald Kane a letter informing him that she had removed herself from his sphere of influence, that she had documented evidence of his manipulation and deception that she would place with an attorney, and that if he continued to pursue her, she would ensure that his own legal exposure was made public in the most inconvenient way possible for him. It was a gamble. Gerald was the kind of man who backed down when confronted with real consequences to himself, and she had collected enough of those consequences over the years of their association to make the threat credible. Gerald retreated. The letters stopped. She told herself she was fine. She told herself that Redstone Creek had been a chapter, that she had written it cleanly and closed it, that she did not lie awake in the small room she rented in Harrow's only boarding house and think about gray eyes and a careful kiss in a thunderstorm and a man who had said "trust me" with his whole body and never once with those specific words. She was not fine. She missed Luke Bishop with a physical constancy that was almost indistinguishable from pain. She heard things over the course of the following months. Redstone Creek was not so far that word didn't travel. She heard that the tension between the two cattle operations had finally broken into something serious, that a man named Cal Decker had been shot in a dispute over fence lines, and that Luke Bishop had arrested the shooter and kept the whole thing from escalating into a full-range war through some combination of legal leverage and personal authority that people spoke about with a respect that bordered on reverence. She heard that the young physician, a Dr. Milton, had left Redstone Creek for better prospects in Pueblo, and that the town was without medical care again. She heard from Clara Holt, who wrote to her faithfully every 3 weeks despite everything, that Luke Bishop had not replaced Minnie Langston in any sense that mattered. "He works," Clara wrote, in her cramped and determined hand. "He works from sunrise to dark and then some. He is polite to everyone and warm to no one. You broke something in that man, Minnie, and I say that to you as someone who loves you, because you deserve to know it, and also because I believe you broke something in yourself when you went, and the two of you are going to have to eventually face each other and say the things that did not get said, or you are both going to turn into very efficient and very sad people, and that would be a terrible waste." Minnie had read that letter 4 times. She had written back to Clara with practical questions about the town's medical needs, sidestepping everything Clara had said with the skill of someone who had been sidestepping for a very long time. Then in August of 1882, 10 months after she had left, 2 things happened in quick succession that changed everything. The first was that she found the one remaining piece of Gerald Kane's trap that she had not yet addressed. She found it in the form of a letter from an attorney in Denver named Harlan Foss, who represented a man named Mr. Arthur Beckley, one of the original victims of Gerald's fraud scheme. Mr. Beckley had spent 18 months investigating exactly who was responsible for the loss of his investment, and Harlan Foss's letter informed Minnie that they had, in that time, built a complete and detailed legal case against Gerald Kane, one that included testimony from multiple witnesses, and a set of documents that clearly demonstrated the distinction between Gerald's culpable actions and the actions of people like Minnie who had signed documents without full knowledge of their contents. Mr. Beckley, the letter explained, was not interested in pursuing people who had been deceived. He was interested in Gerald Kane. And he was writing to Minnie because her documented account of what she had known, and when she had known, it would be helpful in building that case, and because he wanted her to know that she was not a target, that she had never been a target, and that the cloud Gerald Kane had manufactured over her head was about to be formally and legally dissolved. Minnie sat at the small table in her harrow room with that letter, and felt something unlock inside her chest that had been locked for so long she had forgotten. It was a separate thing from her ordinary breathing. She was free. It was over. The hidden motive Gerald had used to control her was being dismantled by someone else's thoroughness, and all she had to do was write her account and sign a statement, and it would be finished. She wrote it that same afternoon, 12 pages of precise and careful truth, and she posted it to Harlan Foss before she could second-guess herself. And then she sat down and thought about what being free actually meant. The second thing happened 4 days later, and it arrived again in the form of a letter, but this one was from Clara Holt, and it was shorter and more urgent than Clara's usual correspondence. "Minnie," it said, "Luke has been hurt. Nothing fatal, and he would murder me for writing to you, but I am writing to you. There was trouble at the Decker Ranch last Thursday. Some business about stolen cattle and a man Luke had been tracking for 3 months, and it went sideways, and Luke took a bullet across his left side that would have been a great deal worse if his deputy had not been quick with a tourniquet. He is recovering. He is being stubborn about it, which means he is doing well enough to be stubborn. But he nearly died, Minnie, and the thing about a man nearly dying is it has a way of clarifying what matters. I think it has clarified things for him. I think you should come home. Come home." Minnie Langston sat in her harrow room and looked at those 2 words for a very long time. She did not let herself think about it too carefully, because careful thought had been what kept her from saying the right things for a year, and she was done with careful. She was done with hiding and managing, and running a controlled retreat from the things that mattered most. She packed her carpetbag that same evening. She had very little to pack, which was its own kind of answer about what she had built in Harrow in 10 months of determined and hollow self-sufficiency. She booked the morning stage. She sat through the 40-mile ride with her hands folded in her lap and her heart beating with a terrified and unmanageable hope. She arrived in Redstone Creek at 2:30 in the afternoon on a Tuesday, and she was recognized by 3 separate people before she had walked a block from the stage stop, all of whom greeted her with a warmth that made her throat ache. She did not go to Tanner's. She did not go to the boarding house. She went to the small rented room she had kept, the one above the hardware store that she had left furnished and paid through a year's lease, because she had not been willing, even in the depths of her departure, to fully let go of the space she had made here. She unlocked the door. The room smelled of dust and old wood, and faintly of the dried lavender she had hung in the window the previous spring. She set her carpetbag on the floor. She opened the window. She sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her palms together and thought about what she was going to say. She was still thinking about it the next morning when she heard the horse. She heard it from 300 yards away because she knew that sound. She had spent 6 months trying to forget it. And then there were 3 knocks on her door and Luke Bishop's voice, low and certain, and 5 words that were the end of running. She reached for the latch. Her fingers were shaking. She opened the door. Luke Bishop stood in the August sun with his hat in his hand and his jaw set, and his gray eyes fixed on her with an expression that was composed of approximately equal parts of pride and desperation, which was such a specifically Luke Bishop combination that she felt something between a laugh and a sob rising in her throat and had to swallow both of them back. He had lost some weight, she could see, across his face, and there was a stiffness in the way he held his left side that told her the wound was still pulling. He was wearing his sheriff's star and his worn canvas coat, and he looked exactly like himself, stubborn and solitary and more necessary to her continued existence than she had any comfortable way to explain. "You came back," he said. "I did," she said. "Why?" She had a speech prepared. She had worked on it for 2 days. It covered the letter from Harlan Foss and the dissolution of Gerald's claims, and the full account of what she had not told him a year ago, and all the reasons she had made the choices she had made, and why those reasons had been insufficient, and what she understood now that she had not understood then. It was a thorough and honest speech, and she had meant every word of it. What came out instead was, Because you were nearly killed and I could not breathe when I found out, and I have been not quite breathing for 10 months, and I am done with not breathing." His expression moved in a way she had never seen it move before. The pride did not disappear exactly, but it shifted, made room for something else, something that in any other man she would have called tenderness without qualification, but that in Luke Bishop was more complicated and therefore more real. "Come inside," she said, because they were standing in her doorway and the street below was not empty, and what she had to say needed privacy. He stepped inside. She closed the door. The room was small and sun-filled and smelled of lavender. She told him everything. All of it, from the beginning, from Gerald Kane and the documents and the mistake and the threats, and the reason she had not said the true things when he had asked her to. She told it plainly, without decoration or excuse, which was the only way she knew how to do anything important. She told him about the letter from Harlan Foss and what it meant and what she had written in her statement. She told him that she had been afraid, not of him, but of his doubt, which she recognized now was a form of not trusting him that she was not proud of. He listened to all of it without interrupting, which was something she had always valued about him, the quality of his attention, the way he gave it completely. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Outside, Redstone Creek went about its business, the distant sound of the blacksmith's hammer, a horse passing, someone calling from one side of the street to the other. "I wish you had told me," he said. "I know. I would have believed you. I was afraid you would not." "That is the part I will need you to work on," he said, and there was something almost wry in it, almost gentle. "Believing that I am capable of seeing past the star when the person in front of me is someone I trust." "You trusted me," she said, "after Gerald came to you. I trusted you the moment I realized you were still working in my town 3 months after arriving," he said. "A woman guilty of the things Kane was describing does not set down roots. She keeps running." He paused. "I was angry, not because I thought you were guilty. Because you chose to run instead of let me help you, and I did not know how to make room for that anger and still act like a fair man." Minnie looked at him for a long moment. "Clara said the bullet nearly killed you," she said. "Clara says a great many things." "Is it true?" He looked at his hands. "It was closer than I have been before," he said. "And while I was lying on the ground waiting for my deputy to bring me back to town, I was thinking about you." He stopped, started again. "I was thinking that I had been proud and I had been alone, and I had told myself those were virtues, that being self-sufficient was the same as being strong. And then I was lying in my own blood in the dirt of the Decker Ranch, and the only clear thought I had was that there was a woman in Harrow, Colorado, who did not know that I had spent 10 months missing her every single day, and I was going to feel like a fool if I never got to tell her." Minnie crossed the room in 3 steps and took his face in both her hands and kissed him the way she had not allowed herself to imagine kissing him for 10 months, completely and without reservation, without the careful management she had applied to everything else in her life. He made a low sound against her mouth and his hands came up to her back and pulled her against him, and she felt him wince when the motion pulled his wound and she pulled back immediately. "Your side," she said. "I am fine." "You are not fine. You were shot 3 weeks ago, and you are certainly not fine." She was already moving, reaching for her herbalist's bag that she had kept packed out of habit, taking out what she needed. "Sit down, Luke." "Minnie, sit down," she said again, and this time it was the voice she used for patients who were being difficult about their own care, and he recognized it because he sat. She cleaned and redressed the wound, which was healing but needed care, and as she worked she talked, quietly and practically, about the things that needed to be said now that the big ones had been said. Gerald Kane's trial in Denver was expected within the year. She would need to give testimony. She would not leave Redstone Creek to do it. She would travel and return, and she would not leave without telling him the truth about where she was going and why. "Where will you stay?" Luke asked. "I have this room," she said. "Your lease is up in November," he said, and then stopped as though he had said more than he intended. Minnie looked up from the bandage she was tying. "How do you know when my lease is up?" He looked, for the first time since she had known him, genuinely embarrassed. "I spoke to the landlord," he said. 8 months ago, I told him I would cover the cost if the lease ran out before he stopped again. Before what? She said softly. Before you came back, he said. If you ever did. She sat back on her heels and looked at this man who had ridden to her door and refused to leave without her, who had paid her rent through her absence, who wore his pride like armor but had been quietly, stubbornly holding her place in the town she had built and fled from, and she felt something settle in her so deeply and completely that she thought it might never move again. Luke Bishop, she said. Yes. You have been keeping this town a room for me. The landlord needed the payment, and I needed something to do, he said, which was about as close to an admission of love as she imagined he got without being directly asked. You are the most aggravating man in Fremont County, she said. Clara Holt was absolutely right. You spoke to Clara. She writes to me faithfully. She has for the last 10 months. Did you know that? Something moved in his expression. No, he said, I did not. She told me about the shooting, Minnie said. That is why I came back. Only that, she looked at him steadily. No, she said, not only that, I was coming back. I had booked the stage before her letter arrived. The letter just made me book it faster. The tension in his jaw released. It was not a smile exactly, but it was the thing that happened in Luke Bishop's face when a smile was what he was feeling. She had learned to read it over months of paying close attention, and she had not forgotten how. There are things we need to say properly, he said. Yes. Not today, he said. Today I want to sit with you in this room that smells like lavender and not think about anything complicated for 1 hour. Minnie looked at him, this careful and proud and deeply necessary man, and said, 1 hour. The 1 hour stretched into 2, and then into the whole afternoon, and they sat together in the small, sun-filled room and talked about small things. The town's gossip, Clara Holt's latest feud with the butcher over the quality of his sausage, the new family that had settled on the east side of town with 7 children, and a determination to start an apple orchard. They talked the way people talk when they have been separated from the person they talk best with, and have 6 months of ordinary life to catch up on. And every word of it felt to Minnie like water after a long, dry journey. He left when the sun went down because it was what propriety required, and neither of them was yet in a position to ignore propriety entirely. But he held her hand at the door for a long moment before he went, and he looked at her with those November Creek eyes, and he said, "Tomorrow." "Tomorrow," she agreed. What followed was a courtship that was very much like their previous one, and also entirely different. Because the hidden things were gone now, all the buried weight and the careful management, and the secrets that had made Minnie's chest tight for more than a year. There were still things to navigate: the formality of the Harlan Foss situation, the reality of Luke's work and its dangers, the ongoing complexity of 2 people who were both accustomed to managing everything alone learning how to manage things together. But none of those things were hidden, and it turned out that the difference between a problem shared and a problem carried alone was the difference between a 20-pound stone and a boulder. Luke was not easy. He never had been, and she did not expect him to become so. He was still proud, still slow to ask for help, still inclined to handle things himself first and mention them afterward. She learned quickly that the way to reach him was not through the front, which was all armor, but through the side, which was where his genuine humor lived, dry and unexpected, and through the particular kind of attention he gave when she was explaining something that interested her, full and focused and honest. She was not easy either. She was stubborn and independent, and had a well-established habit of making decisions first and consulting people second that she had to consciously work against. She had opinions about everything, and she expressed them without softening, which occasionally led to arguments that were vigorous and thorough, and always resolved, because neither of them was willing to leave the other unfinished. The arguing was, in its own way, wonderful. She had never had someone engage with her the way Luke did, fully and honestly and without condescension, treating her as an intellectual equal in a time and place where that was not automatically offered to women. He disagreed with her on specific and reasoned grounds, and he changed his mind when she persuaded him, and he said so plainly, which was a rarer quality in a man than it should have been. Clara Holt was insufferably pleased about all of it. She had instituted a practice of inviting them both to Sunday dinner within the first month of Minnie's return, and she presided over those dinners with the satisfaction of a general who has successfully executed a very long campaign. "I knew," she said, frequently and without prompting, "that you two would find your way back to each other. I knew it from the first week after you left, Minnie, because he came to fix my step again even though it did not need fixing, just to have something useful to do with his hands." "Clara," Luke said. "You are welcome, dear," Clara said. In November, Luke asked Minnie to marry him. He did it in the most Luke Bishop way possible, which was directly and without ceremony and slightly earlier in the evening than she had expected, while they were walking back from Della Pierce's house where they had gone for supper. He stopped walking and she stopped beside him, and he turned to look at her and said, "I would like you to marry me. I want to be clear that I am asking, not assuming, and if you need time to think about it, I will not take that as a refusal." Minnie looked up at the November sky, which was enormous and cold and thick with stars the way frontier skies got on clear nights, and she thought about the carpetbag she had arrived with and the room above the hardware store and the step Clara Holt's front porch that Luke had fixed 3 times now on various pretexts, and she said, "I do not need time to think about it." "No," he said. "No," she said. "The answer is yes, Luke. The answer has been yes for quite a long time." They were married in December of 1882, on a Saturday, in the small church on Harrow Road that served Redstone Creek's various Protestant denominations, without inquiring too closely into their differences. Clara Holt cried from the first hymn to the final blessing. Della Pierce brought enough food to feed the entire town, which she had arranged with the assistance of 3 other ranchers' wives, and which resulted in the most improbable wedding supper Minnie had ever attended, covering 3 tables end to end in the church hall. Luke's deputy, a young man named Sam Greer, who had been with Luke for 2 years, and was devoted to him with the particular loyalty of someone who has seen another person at their best and worst and chosen to stay, made a toast that was brief and sincere, and made Luke clear his throat twice in the way he did when he was moved by something and unwilling to admit it. Minnie wore a dress that Clara had helped her make from blue wool, not white, because she was a practical woman and blue wool was warm and useful, and she was getting married in Colorado in December. Luke wore his good coat and had actually gotten a haircut, which Minnie counted as evidence of the profound seriousness of his intentions. They moved into the house that Luke had been renting on the east side of town, which was larger than either of their previous accommodations, and had a room that she immediately claimed as a workroom for her herbs, and a kitchen with a proper stove, and a porch that caught the morning light from the south, and was therefore a place of great value to Minnie, who had learned from a childhood of difficult mornings that a good porch could change the character of a whole day. The first months of their marriage were a revelation in the specific way that being truly known by another person is always a revelation, because it is not the smooth and golden thing that romantic imagination suggests, but it is also far better than imagination suggests in the ways that matter most. Luke learned that Minnie talked in her sleep, which she had never known about herself, and that she ground dried herbs first thing in the morning before she was fully awake, and then couldn't remember doing it later, and that she cried easily at injustice but almost never at personal pain, having apparently decided at some point in her history that personal pain was her own business to manage. Minnie learned that Luke was a man who felt things very deeply, and had spent so long not expressing those feelings that he had developed an entire internal language for them, a set of actions and gestures and patterns of attention that stood in for words, and that learning to read this language was one of the most satisfying and ongoing projects of her life. She learned that he had nightmares sometimes, not often, but sometimes, about things he had seen in the course of his work that had stayed with him, and that the best thing she could do when this happened was not to speak, but to put her hand on his chest, flat, until his breathing steadied. She learned that he was funny, genuinely funny, in a way that surprised people who had only seen his professional exterior, with a sense of humor that was dry and precise, and always landed because it came from real observation rather than performance. She learned that he was capable of extraordinary gentleness, that the hands that carried a rifle with such practiced certainty could also tend to the small hurts of daily life with a care that consistently caught her off guard. Gerald Kane's trial happened in February of 1883. Minnie traveled to Denver with Luke, who used 2 weeks of accumulated time he never took to make the journey. She gave her testimony clearly and completely, and Harlan Foss built the case with the methodical thoroughness that Arthur Beckley had apparently been funding for 18 months. And Gerald Kane was convicted of fraud and conspiracy and sentenced to 7 years in the Colorado State Penitentiary. The conviction formally cleared Minnie's name of any association with his crimes, a matter that was noted in the Denver Post in a paragraph that was small and buried on page 4, but which she cut out and kept nonetheless, because sometimes the small official acknowledgement of a truth matters more than its size suggests. On the stage back to Redstone Creek, Luke took her hand and held it the whole way, which he did not often do in public, and she did not say anything about it, but she did press his hand once briefly, in the silent communication they had developed that meant something along the lines of "thank you for being here." "It is done," he said, somewhere around the midpoint of the journey. "It is," she said. "How does it feel?" She thought about it honestly. "Like putting down something heavy," she said. "Something I had been carrying so long I had started to think it was just part of me." He nodded slowly. "Things that you carry long enough do that," he said. She looked at him. "Spoken from experience." "Spoken from experience," he said, and left it there, because some acknowledgments were enough without being expanded, and both of them had learned to recognize the difference. Spring came to Redstone Creek with the particular violence it always did in the Colorado high country, alternating warm days and late snowstorms, the kind of weather that required you to carry both your winter coat and your faith that it would eventually be warm. Minnie's practice had grown considerably in the months of her return. She had taken on an apprentice of sorts, a 15-year-old girl named Rose Fuller, whose genuine aptitude for plant medicine was obvious to anyone who spent 5 minutes watching her work, and whose family was finally convinced that teaching her this skill was not only permissible but potentially the making of her future. Minnie taught Rose with the same approach her own mentor had used, practically and without condescension, expecting competence and explaining why rather than simply what. Luke's work had its rhythms and its crises. The Decker situation that had nearly killed him was resolved. The shooter had served his time and left the territory, and the Decker operation had been sold to a family from Kansas who proved to be considerably easier neighbors. There were still disputes, still occasional violence of the low-level frontier variety, still the ongoing administrative work of maintaining law in a place where law was relatively new and sometimes still contested. But Redstone Creek in 1883 was not the raw and volatile place it had been in 1881, and that quieting was due in no small part to the steady 4-year presence of Luke Bishop, who was the kind of law enforcement that a community built itself around whether it knew it was doing so or not. They argued in April about whether to get a dog, which Luke thought was unnecessary and Minnie thought was reasonable, and which they eventually resolved by getting the dog, a large and amiable red hound named Copper, who immediately attached himself to Luke with the absolute devotion of the utterly uncomplicated, which Luke pretended to find annoying for approximately 3 weeks before surrendering entirely, and being observed by Minnie on multiple occasions talking to the dog in ways he would never have talked to a person, with complete and unguarded directness. "You are speaking honestly to a dog," she told him one evening, watching from the kitchen doorway as he had what appeared to be a genuine conversation with Copper about the day's events. "He does not repeat things," Luke said, without a trace of embarrassment. "Neither do I," Minnie said. He looked over at her. "You are considerably more likely to form opinions about what I tell you," he said. "Copper just listens." "I can listen without forming opinions," she said. "You absolutely cannot," he said, and she conceded the point because it was fair. In June of 1883, Minnie realized she was expecting a child. She recognized the signs before she was certain enough to say anything: the particular fatigue, the way certain smells had become unbearable, the knowledge that sat in her body before it made itself fully clear. She sat with the knowledge for 4 days, not from secrecy this time, but from something more like wonder, the enormous and humbling reality of what was happening. She told Luke on a Sunday morning on the porch that caught the morning light. He had his coffee and she had her tea, and Copper was sprawled across the top step with his chin on his paws, and she said, "I need to tell you something." He looked at her immediately, the way he always did when she used that particular tone, with his full attention. "What is it?" she told him, simply, directly, watching his face. What happened in Luke Bishop's face in the moment after she told him she was expecting his child was something she had never seen before and would remember for the rest of her life. The armor did not just shift this time. It was gone entirely for a full 10 seconds, and what was there underneath it was something so undefended and joyful that it made her eyes sting, because she had not known, until this moment, that his face was capable of that particular expression. He set down his coffee. He stood up. He crossed to her and took both her hands and held them and looked at her without saying anything for a moment that contained more than most conversations. "Minnie," he finally said. "Yes," she said, because she understood what he was saying. He pulled her close and held her with the careful, thorough tenderness of a man who had spent his whole adult life being needed by other people, and had finally, at 33 years old, been given something that was simply, entirely his to love. Copper got up and pushed his large head between them both, and they laughed, and that felt right too. The pregnancy was healthy and largely uneventful, which Minnie was grateful for and attributed in part to the extensive knowledge of supportive herbs and rest and proper nourishment that she had accumulated over years of professional practice. Clara Holt was ecstatic about the baby in a way that was only slightly less intense than her feelings about the wedding, and she immediately began knitting with a focused energy that produced, over the following months, more small woolen items than any single infant could reasonably require. Della Pierce threw a party that she called a gathering, but was in all practical senses a party, with considerable food, and a great deal of cheerful advice from every woman in Redstone Creek who had borne children, some of which was useful, and some of which was the kind of confident wrong information that gets passed between generations, as though repetition confers accuracy. Luke had not been, Minnie thought, a man who had ever particularly imagined himself as a father. He had been too self-contained for that kind of forward imagining. But in the months of the pregnancy, she watched something develop in him that was distinct from everything that had come before, a quality of anticipation that was different from anything she had seen in him, quiet and enormous, and directed with his characteristic completeness toward this new thing that was coming. He read, which surprised her. He had always read newspapers and legal texts and the occasional novel that he finished in 2 days and then did not mention. But now he came home from the circuit rider who sold books out of a wagon with a medical text on the care of infants and a practical guide to child-rearing that had been published in 1879 and contained a mixture of genuinely good advice and the sort of alarming recommendations that made Minnie, with her medical background, genuinely wince. He read them both cover to cover and then asked her, with the directness that was the most reliable thing about him, which parts were sensible and which were rubbish, and they had a long and honest conversation about it that ended with her throwing out approximately a third of the conventional wisdom of the era and him accepting her conclusions, because she had reasoned them and not merely asserted them. The baby came in the early morning of February the 14th, 1884, which Clara Holt considered a romantic sign, and which Luke considered a statistic that was no more meaningful than any other, but which he noted without comment when Clara made her views known. The birth was attended by Minnie, Rose Fuller, Clara, and Della Pierce, because Minnie was the only trained medical practitioner available, and had decided well in advance that she would be directing her own care with the assistance of people she trusted, which was an unconventional approach that everyone in the room accepted because Minnie was the one in charge of her own body, and had been for her entire adult life. Luke was not in the room because the convention of the time did not permit it, and he sat in the kitchen through the 8 hours with Copper at his feet, and his deputy Sam Greer, who had come because Sam always seemed to appear in situations where Luke needed someone without being asked, and without requiring acknowledgement for the appearance. They sat together and drank coffee and did not say much, which was the correct approach. The baby was a boy. He was healthy and vigorous, and possessed from the first minutes of a set of lungs that made his presence unambiguous. Minnie held him in the gray February light that came through the bedroom window, and felt the particular fierce tenderness that she had heard described, and had not quite been able to imagine until this moment, so absolute and irreversible that it reorganized everything she understood about priority. Luke came in when Clara went to get him, which she did with the triumph of someone delivering the best possible news. He stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at Minnie with the baby, and then he crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed, and looked at his son with those gray eyes that had never once in Minnie's knowledge of him been uncertain, and they were completely uncertain now, wide and open, and undone with something that was not fear but was adjacent to it. "Hello," he said to the baby, very quietly, which was such an absolutely Luke Bishop opening that Minnie started to cry, which was the first time she had cried during the whole proceeding because she had been too busy managing it. "What do you want to name him?" she asked. He thought about it for a long moment. She waited. He did not rush things, and she had stopped expecting him to. "Thomas," he said, "if that is agreeable to you." She looked at him, and the love she had for him was too large for the chest it lived in. "Thomas," she said. "Yes." Thomas Luke Bishop, named for her brother and carrying his father's name as a middle, was a person of strong opinions and considerable noise from approximately week 2 of his life, which Luke took as evidence of good character, and which Minnie took as evidence of genetics operating without mercy in both directions. He was fair-haired like Minnie and gray-eyed like Luke, and he was, from the very beginning, comprehensively loved. The 3 years that followed were, in the way of good years, not dramatic. There was no crisis to report, no dark past rearing back up, no hidden betrayal to uncover. There was the ordinary business of 2 people building a life together in a frontier town that was growing slowly toward something more settled, the kind of work that was unglamorous and important and got done one day at a time. Minnie's practice expanded. She trained Rose Fuller thoroughly enough that by 1886 Rose was working independently, serving the families on the eastern ranches who could not easily make the trip to town. Luke's position became something close to permanent institution, the kind of sheriff that a town built its idea of itself around, not because he was legendary, but because he was consistent. Redstone Creek built a proper schoolhouse in 1885, and Minnie was on the committee that hired the teacher, a young woman from Ohio named Harriet Wells, who had the tremendous dual advantage of actual qualifications and a genuine liking for children. Thomas started school in the autumn of 1889, at 5 years old, and came home that first day full of information that he delivered to his parents at supper, with the characteristic intensity of someone who has just discovered that the world is larger than previously suspected. Luke listened to all of it with the same quality of attention he had always given to the things that mattered to him, and Minnie watched her husband and her son across the supper table and felt the fullness of her life as something almost unbearably present. The second child came in 1887. This one was a girl, born in spring, healthy and immediate in her demands. They named her Clara, after the woman who had written faithful letters and kept two stubborn people from losing each other entirely. And Clara Holt herself was so moved by this that she cried for a straight hour, and then rallied and made an exceptionally large quantity of food as her customary response to strong emotion. Luke with his daughter was a different thing than Luke with his son, not more or less, but specifically different in the way that parenthood always discovered specific differences where general expectation had anticipated general sameness. Clara was a quieter child than Thomas, more observant, with a habit of watching things carefully before she engaged with them that Luke recognized from his own childhood, and Minnie found both endearing and slightly unnerving for its familiarity. Clara attached herself to her father with a particular intensity at around age 2 that Luke accepted with the bewildered and complete devotion of a man who had not anticipated being this important to anyone small. There was an evening in the summer of 1888 when Minnie was sitting on the porch with her tea watching the light go off the mountains, and Luke was in the yard with Thomas and Clara, conducting what appeared to be some form of educational exercise involving a large stick and the relative properties of different types of soil. And she thought about the woman who had arrived in Redstone Creek 7 years earlier with a carpetbag and a determined face, and a secret she was afraid to speak. And she could not quite make those two women feel like the same person, but they were. They were the same person, and the path between them was not a mystery, it was just this: a series of choices, some of them wrong, some of them terrifying, some of them made in the dark with nothing but stubbornness to navigate by, all of them leading forward because there was only ever forward, and forward had brought her here, to this porch in this light with this life. Luke looked up from the yard, directly at her, with those gray eyes that she had been reading for 7 years and that still occasionally surprised her, and he gave her the look that was not quite a smile, but was always better than a smile, the one that was entirely for her, that nobody else saw because it only existed when he was looking at her, and she gave it back in her own way, the particular arrangement of her expression that said everything that did not need to be said aloud. Thomas said something urgent about the stick. Luke's attention returned to his son. Clara Holt came for Sunday dinner that week as she did every week, and she sat at the head of the table that was not her table, but that she had claimed by long habit and general authority, and she watched Luke pass the bread to Minnie before he served himself, and she watched Thomas correct his father on some point of natural history with absolute confidence, and she watched little Clara fall asleep against her father's arm while the adults finished their coffee, and she said, with the satisfaction of someone whose best long-term project had come in exactly as hoped, "I am very proud of you both." "Clara," Luke said. "You are welcome, dear," Clara said. In 1889, Gerald Kane was released from prison having served 6 of his 7 years, and Minnie heard about it in a letter from Harlan Foss, who made a point of informing her because he had promised he would. She sat with the information for a day and examined it carefully for any trace of fear and found none. Gerald Kane existed in her life as a past event, a thing that had happened and been resolved, as much a part of her present as the carpetbag she no longer owned, having replaced it years ago with a proper traveling trunk. She wrote back to Harlan Foss thanking him for the information and went on with her day. She told Luke that evening, not from duty but from the simple habit of telling him things, which was its own form of the trust she had taken so long to offer and which she now extended without thought. He listened. He nodded. He said, "If he causes any trouble, you tell me." "He will not cause trouble," she said. "He has no leverage and he knows it." "Still," Luke said. She looked at him. "Still," she agreed, because some reassurances were offered as gestures of protection and should be accepted as such, regardless of whether the practical need for them was real. The 1890s came in with the territory itself changing. Colorado had been a state since 1876, but the frontier quality of places like Redstone Creek was shifting perceptibly, the wild looseness of the early days giving way to something more structured, more permanent. The railroad extended a spur line 12 miles from town in 1891, which changed everything about commerce and travel and the speed at which information and goods arrived, and which brought new people, new problems, new energies, all of which required adjusting to. Luke adjusted. This was one of the things she most admired about him and had not fully expected, that underneath the stubbornness and the pride was an adaptability that was real and flexible, a willingness to understand that the job changed as the world changed, and that holding onto the methods of the past when the present had different needs was a form of failure, not loyalty. He learned the new legal frameworks that came with increased territorial organization. He worked with the circuit court judge to improve the processes for handling disputes that now involved larger commercial interests. He mentored Sam Greer with the specific intention of eventually passing the office to him, not because Luke was finished, but because his particular strengths were moving towards civic administration, and Sam's were better suited to the day-to-day work. Thomas, at 7, was already reading above his years, a fact that his teacher Harriet Wells reported with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely delighted in the phenomenon. He had a quality of seriousness that was his father's, and a curiosity that was his mother's, and a laugh that seemed to belong entirely to himself, unexpected and complete and joyful in a way that occasionally stopped the adults in the room because of its purity. Clara at 4 was a small and deliberate person who had her father's way of watching things before engaging with them, but who, when she engaged, did so with a total commitment that recalled nobody so much as Minnie herself, charging in with full conviction once the calculation was complete. She had taken an early and passionate interest in Minnie's dried herbs, which she organized with a seriousness that was both charming and occasionally inconvenient when she reorganized systems that Minnie had established for professional reasons. "She is going to be a healer," Clara Holt announced, watching young Clara arrange dried rose hips with focused precision. "She is going to be whatever she decides to be," Minnie said. "In this case, I believe those are the same thing," Clara Holt said. Luke stood in the doorway and watched his daughter rearrange his wife's workroom and said nothing, which was his particular form of agreement. In the spring of 1892, Minnie found out she was expecting again, their third. She was 35 years old, which was not young for this, and she attended to the pregnancy with the particular carefulness of someone who understood both the statistics and the individual variables, and who was determined to come through it well because there were 2 children and a man who needed her, and she had not come this far to be careless with her own health. The pregnancy was harder than the first 2. There were weeks of difficult nausea and a period in the 5th month where she was more tired than she had been in her life, and Luke managed the household during those weeks with the same focused competence he brought to everything, learning to cook adequately, recruiting Clara Holt as necessary, making sure Thomas and young Clara had what they needed without making Minnie feel that she was being managed around. He sat with her in the evenings and read to her, which was a reversal of their earlier habit but which she accepted with gratitude and without fuss. "You are a very good man," she told him one evening in the 7th month. He looked at her over the book. "You say that as though you are surprised by it." "I am not surprised," she said. "I am just noting it. I do not say it often enough." "You say it in other ways," he said, which was true. The 3rd child was born in November of 1892, on a cold, clear night with the stars brilliant above Redstone Creek. Another boy. He was smaller than Thomas had been, quieter in the first moments, and then he made himself known with a thoroughness that suggested he had simply been preparing. He was dark-haired, a thing that appeared from nowhere in the genetics of this red-haired and dark-haired family, and he had Luke's jaw already visible in miniature and Minnie's green eyes. They named him James Henry Bishop. James for Luke's father, whom he had rarely spoken of, but whom many understood had been a figure of significance in how Luke had become himself. And Henry for no particular reason except that when they said it aloud it seemed to suit the small person they were looking at. 3, Luke said, very quietly, in the hour after the house had settled, and the children were asleep and James was in Minnie's arms, and it was just the two of them in the lamplight. 3, Minnie agreed. That is considerably more than I had imagined, he said, which was not a complaint and they both knew it. How much had you imagined? She asked. He thought about it with the honesty he always brought to the question of his own inner experience. None, he said. I had not imagined any of it, not the house, not the children, not any of it. He paused. I had imagined alone. I had been so long at alone that it had started to look like enough. She looked at him across the lamplight and the sleeping baby. And now, he said, I cannot find alone anywhere and I have stopped looking. She reached out her free hand and he took it, and they sat like that in the lamplight of their home in Redstone Creek, Colorado, in November of 1892, with the wind outside and the warmth inside and 3 sleeping children and a dog getting old now. Copper's muzzle had gone white, and all the things that had been secrets and fears and hidden motives and dark pasts had been brought into the light, examined, and resolved, one by one, in the way that honest people resolve things. With difficulty and time and the consistent willingness to try again, Luke Bishop had ridden to her door on a hot August morning and said he was not leaving without her. He had meant it then with the pride of a man who was not fully certain of his welcome but was certain of his own conviction. He had meant it in all the years that followed, not dramatically but completely, the way he meant everything, without fanfare and without revision, not leaving, with her. It turned out that those were the only coordinates required. Minnie Langston, who had arrived in a frontier town with a carpetbag and a secret and the stubborn determination of someone who had decided to build something from nothing, had built something. It was not nothing. It was not the tidy and solitary life she had imagined building, but it was better than what she had imagined, in the specific way that the things we cannot imagine in advance of experiencing them are always better than our imagination. Because imagination works only with what we have already known, and what she had come to know with Luke Bishop was something entirely new. Clara Holt died in the spring of 1895, peacefully in her sleep, at the age of 68, which was a good age and a good way to go, and which left a space in Redstone Creek that could not be filled because it was a Clara Holt-shaped space, and there was only one of those. Minnie sat by her grave in the April sunshine and talked to her for a while, about the things Clara had seen, and the things she had done, and the letter she had written that had told a stubborn woman the truth she needed to hear. Luke stood beside Minnie with his hand on her shoulder and said nothing, which was the right thing, because Clara Holt had known better than anyone that silence offered with love is its own complete language. Thomas was 11 that spring, and he understood death in the way that children of the frontier understood it, as a real and present thing that was not to be hidden from, and he grieved for Clara with a sincerity that made the adults around him more able to grieve themselves, because there is something about a child's uncomplicated sorrow that gives permission for the more defended sorrow of grown people. Young Clara was 7, and she took the loss hard in the particular way that sensitive and observant children take losses, quietly and for longer than expected, processing it in her own internal way and emerging from the other side of it slightly older, the way all real grief makes us older. James was 2 and would not remember Clara Holt, which Minnie considered one of the small, genuine sadnesses of his early life, and about which she intended to tell him stories for the rest of her own, so that he would know, if not remember. Sam Greer formally took over as sheriff of Redstone Creek in the fall of 1895, at Luke's recommendation, and with the town council's full agreement, and Luke took a position as county administrator that suited both his skills and his temperament, considerably better than active law enforcement, had suited a man approaching 45 with 3 children and a wife who had earned the right not to worry about him getting shot. He wore the administrative role with the same quiet authority he had brought to the sheriff's star, without ego, without the need for credit, with the simple focus of a person doing what needed doing and doing it well. Minnie's practice in those years had expanded from the corner of Tanner's General Store into a proper building, a small but real medical herbalist's office on Crane Street, 2 doors from the boarding house where she had rented her first room. Rose Fuller, now Mrs. Rose Atkins, ran a second branch of the practice serving the outlying ranches, and the 2 of them had trained 2 more apprentices over the years, building the kind of knowledge transfer that Minnie's own mentor had given her, practical and generous and oriented toward a future where the next generation would carry it forward. On the evening of their 15th wedding anniversary, in December of 1897, Luke built a fire in the front room, while Thomas managed the younger children with the responsible seriousness of a 13-year-old who understood that his parents occasionally needed to be left alone, a maturity that Minnie suspected was somewhat coached by Della Pierce, who had been a consistent presence in all 3 children's lives and had a gift for meeting young people where they were. Luke and Minnie sat by the fire with their tea and coffee, and the comfortable silence of people who have been talking to each other for 15 years and still find things to say. "Do you remember the morning I came to your door?" he asked. "Frequently," she said. "Were you afraid when you heard me coming?" he asked. He had never asked this directly before, and she understood that he was asking it now because 15 years and 3 children and a whole life built together had made the answer to that question a thing he could hear without its shadow touching the present. "I was terrified," she said honestly. "Not of you, of myself, of what I would do or not do." "What were you afraid you would do?" "Run again," she said. "I was afraid I would open that door and look at you and still be too afraid to stop running." He nodded slowly. "And when you opened it?" She looked at him across the firelight. This man who had been her anchor and her argument and her home for 15 years, who wore his gray in his hair now, and his years in the lines of his face and his decade and a half of being loved in the quality of his bearing, which was still upright and proud, but no longer solitary, no longer the careful isolation of a man who had decided to need nothing. "When I opened it," she said, "I remembered that you had said you were not leaving without me, and I realized that I had stopped being someone who was leaving." He set down his coffee cup. He leaned forward and took both her hands the way he had done on the November night when he had asked her to marry him, with the same careful deliberateness, as though the moment deserved to be properly held. "Good," he said, and that was enough. It had always been enough with him to say the true thing plainly, and to know it was heard, and to sit in the warmth of it together without needing to make it more than it was, because what it was already everything. Outside, the Colorado winter pressed against the windows of their house on the east side of Redstone Creek, and Thomas could be heard explaining something at length to his younger siblings in the next room, and Copper's successor, a young hound named Russet who had appeared at the back door the previous spring and declined to leave, was asleep in front of the kitchen stove, and the mountains that ringed the valley were white and enormous and indifferent in the way of all large, beautiful things, and inside in the firelight, Luke Bishop and Minnie Langston Bishop held each other's hands across 15 years and a whole life, and all the things they had found their way back from, and the warmth. Between them was the specific warmth of people who know exactly what they have and have chosen it, every day on purpose, with open eyes. Redstone Creek grew in those last years of the century, as Colorado grew, as the frontier continued its long transformation into something more settled and more ordinary, which was not a loss but simply a change, the way everything changes when it has been long enough in one place to put down roots. The town Minnie had arrived in with nothing was not the town she lived in now, and the woman who had arrived was not the woman she was now, and the man who had stood on the other side of her door and refused to ride away was not the same man who sat across from her in the firelight. And all of these changes were the evidence of a life actually lived, fully and without reservation, which was the only way she had ever known how to do anything once she had stopped being afraid. James, at 7, became fascinated with his mother's work and began a phase of intense herbalist experimentation that was supervised very carefully, and which resulted in 3 minor household disasters and 1 genuinely useful discovery about the properties of local yarrow that Minnie noted in her record book with his name beside it. Luke found this charming in a way he expressed by asking James very serious and specific questions about his findings, which James answered with equal seriousness, the two of them sitting at the kitchen table in intense consultation, while Minnie stood in the doorway and watched with the fullness she had learned to simply receive rather than analyze. Clara, at 10, had decided she was going to be a physician, not a medical herbalist but an actual physician with a medical degree, and she had made this announcement at Sunday dinner with the composure of someone who has already thought it through and is presenting a conclusion rather than a proposal. Luke had looked at her for a long moment and said that if that was what she wanted she should pursue it with everything she had, and that he would make sure she had what she needed to get there. Minnie had thought about the young physician who had come to Redstone Creek in 1881 and left within a year because the conditions were not good enough for his ambitions, and she had thought about her daughter who was not going to leave and who was going to be considerably better at it. Thomas, in 1898 at 14, was reading law. Luke had books. Thomas had found them. What had followed was a reading program that Luke had organized without being asked, working through the text systematically with Thomas in the evenings, not teaching so much as studying alongside. 2 people of different generations and similar temperaments engaged in the same inquiry. Minnie watched this and thought about Thomas Langston, her brother, who had said that a town was only as good as the way it took care of its own, and she thought that in his nephew he had someone who was going to take care of a great many people's own, in the fullness of time. The last day of 1899 was a Sunday. Minnie and Luke stood on their porch in the winter sunshine and looked at the town that spread out below the East Side Rise, Redstone Creek, Colorado, not as it had been in 1881 with its raw edges and its latent violence and its frontier uncertainty, but as it was now, established and growing and full of people going about the ordinary, extraordinary business of their lives. The schoolhouse, the church, the new post office, Crane Street with its row of establishments including her own small office, the sheriff's office with Sam Greer's name on the placard, the boarding house where Clara Holt had fed her salt pork and beans and armed her with information. 20 years of this century left behind, Luke said. And a whole new one ahead, Minnie said. He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and they looked at their town together in the last winter light of the 19th century, and neither of them said anything for a long while, because the moment was complete without addition. Thomas came to the door and called them in for dinner. Young Clara was already at the table. James had knocked something over in the kitchen and was explaining vigorously to Russet the Hound why it was not entirely his fault. Minnie pushed off the doorframe and went inside, and Luke followed her, the door closing behind them both on the winter air, on the mountains and the porch and the century turning, into the warm and noisy interior of the life they had made together, which was irreversible and full and entirely, permanently, their own.